Welcome, everyone. This is Chipicon, and you are listening to the CTCW Wednesday show. And if you have a suggestion for giving it a name, we could probably use a better one than CTCW Wednesday. Mary Alice wanted to call it the Chipicon show, and I absolutely refused. So this is a taste. You know, every Wednesday we'll give you a free taste of what happens at the conference in the fall, which is mid-November. And this tonight we have Morgan Daimler as a guest, and so I'm not going to have to be talking all night. I'm going to try to ask pertinent questions. Morgan Daimler is, oh my God, when we first met her, she was a relatively insecure young.
I still am. Don't worry, I still am.
who was like, oh, you should give her a shot, says Ellen Everett Hopman. She says, she knows everything about the Celtic world. It's like, cool. We love that. And she did and then she started writing books, and she got so big that she couldn't fit us into her schedule for a while. So that was kind of fun. But
that's slightly inaccurate retelling of events.
Is it?
The conference tends to fall around my middle child's birthday. So all the years where it's on are really close to November 11th.
That's why she mutes us.
Because otherwise, yeah.
So there were a couple years where I would have been gone for my daughter's birthday. So that was why I couldn't do it. But yeah, I think it was 2010 was the first conference.
Yes, 2010 was the first.
Yep.
So
that was way back.
Yeah, but basically, she is on Facebook. She has a podcast. It's her own. No, not a podcast.
YouTube.
I'm sorry, I'm bad with the proper slang. She has her own blog, and you can also find her on Facebook. And she blogs on Patheos too, and she's got tons of books. I am currently I just picked up the Fairy Encyclopedia, and it's very, very cool. Okay, is there anything I missed in describing you that I ought to?
I think that's all the highlights. Yeah, I write nonfiction. I write a little bit of fiction, mix it up a bit.
Oh, I want to start with two things. The first is, what's a fairy? And then I'm going to ask you to be help us to pronounce things. When you use a term, tell us how it's spelled so that we can say, oh, I've been pronouncing that Sith forever.
Oh yeah, she.
Daoine Sith is what's the real pronunciation?
Dinashi.
See, that makes sense. Okay.
I'm going to type that in the chat for anyone who's in the chat.
And my daughter says Gesundheit.
That is not what I said.
How it's spelled.
Anyway,
yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Go over some terms.
Okay, let's start out with what's a fairy, so that we at least are all using the term relatively the same, because isn't that the basis of what's going on right now, why we're talking about this in first?
It has become a subject that's increasingly more confusing, I think, for people. It was always confusing, but it's definitely gotten more so. The word fairy itself comes into English from French, from Latin, and it initially just meant like a being of the otherworld. I should say initially it meant the otherworld. It was used sort of for the place and anything with the nature of that place, the world of fairy, if you will. And then it sort of, in about the 13th, 14th centuries, came to be used for these specific types of beings, which is anything that was otherworldly, anything that was from this world of fairy. And when we talk about what fairies are, we're really talking about everything in this kind of really wide range. Anything that comes from this other world. So you have some that are very human looking, you have some that are giant, you have some that are fairly small, you have some that are cats, dogs, horses, shapeshifters. It's a really wide range. And the word for quite a long time was used synonymously with other terms, including elf, imp, goblin. They were all sort of equated to each other. It wasn't a specific word the way we sometimes see it today, where people will talk about the sort of tiny winged fairies as if that's what a fairy is, and then everything else is kind of different. It's always been this sort of generic term. So I think that's where a lot of people's confusion starts. And just so we're all clear, there is no standardized spelling for it. You can spell it however you want, and it's just as accurate and legitimate as any other spelling. I think there's something like 90 different variant spellings across the historical record, and some of them are hilarious. Like, it's just to pick any combination of letters that you think could possibly sound like the word fairy, and you're good. It really wasn't standardized till really, really recently.
Well, that's kind of true about all pre the 18th century spelling.
Yep.
So
yeah, well, you'll sometimes run across online people trying to argue that there's like a legitimate spelling and that the other ones like mean something different or aren't the same kind of thing. And yeah, no, it's
So-
total anarchy.
how do you differentiate between fae and fairy?
Sure, that's another thing that tends to come up a lot. For myself, I tend to use the term synonymously,
Okay.
or interchangeably. Fae is actually the original French, and I think the modern, I can't speak French, but the modern French is still fee, F, E with an accent mark E. But it comes from the older French fae, F-E-A. And that was what was taken into English and became fairy, for sort of this land, this otherworldly place, and then has gone on from there. So to me, they're kind of equivalent terms. You will sometimes see people arguing, particularly the ones that see fairy as a very specific sylph-like kind of being, the tiny winged figures, that fae is the generic term, that's what you apply to everything, and then fairy is something specific. But sort of across the bulk of the material we have, they're pretty much used interchangeably. And fairy, in folklore and in academia, is just sort of the standard catch-all term. So
Well, I like your term otherworldly because that pretty much covers it too.
Yep.
There seem to be, most cultures have otherworldly beings.
yes.
And so I'm pretty sure they work. And the thing is, my theory, jumping in, as I probably should not.
This is fun.
No, on the, well, yeah, discussions. But my theory is that we see everything through a filter. If you've ever heard about taking eyewitness testimony, and police hate eyewitness because it's frequently wrong, people see things through filters. And I think that when you catch a little something out of the corner of your eye, your personal filter is going to fill in a lot of the details that your eye missed, or your third eye, if that's what you're seeing it from.
That's actually an interesting point to bring up, because there's this whole thing when you look at the concept of fairies. And as I keep mentioning, the idea of them being smaller and having wings, and that's not accurate to what fairies are, or the entirety of what fairies are. The idea of fairies having wings, I have to give this little background before I get into my actual point here. The entirety of fairies having wings comes to us really from the theater, specifically the 17th and 18th century theater. We're probably pulling the ideas from earlier, particularly the writings of Paracelsus, the alchemist. And he was very big on the four elements and sylphs representing air, and that kind of got taken then during this later period and transferred to this idea of depicting fairies in the theater having these insect wings, butterfly wings, dragonfly wings, which was a good way for the audience to be able to visually identify which characters are supposed to be fairies. And then from there, it got taken into artwork. And then from there, it got taken into fiction, which is kind of getting into the 19th and 20th centuries. But all of this time, when we have anecdotal accounts, people don't see fairies with wings. People who are describing encounters with fairies, it's the traditional, what we would call the older folkloric, I guess, depictions of fairies. However, because this image of fairies with wings has kind of really saturated popular culture, within the last 40 years or so, we are starting to see anecdotal accounts of fairies with wings. And I think that relates to exactly what you were saying that I kind of jumped off from to say all this. Yeah, that you see what you expect to see, or your mind fills in, or, you know, the flip side of that is you could argue that they're giving you what you expect to see, giving you the winged fairies that you're anticipating. But there's definitely that connection between expectation and then what you get. It doesn't always happen. There's also anecdotal accounts of total skeptics who don't know anything about fairies who nonetheless have these encounters. But I definitely think being primed and expecting a specific thing is going to make it more likely for you to get that thing.
Yeah, but I believe we can invoke or invite fairies into our lives, perhaps foolishly, perhaps unwittingly, perhaps intentionally, but not knowing what we're asking for. A friend of mine who was living in a neighborhood that they moved to, and she thought it would be very cool to have fairies come into their yard to play with her two young children. And so she invited the fairies. Yes, I see you wincing. So.
Sorry, it was not a subtle
No
response.
Fairies rarely are. No, we've had our own experiences with, you know the old stories of cows getting knots in their tails and
horses getting knots in their manes. Yeah,
knots in your hair thing is definitely something that I've seen them do.
Yeah, so. Yeah, I've seen that happen as well. Elf locks, they're called. Yep.
Anyway, but hey, look, what's it that they told us in Labyrinth? What did you expect? I thought they were nice. They bit me.
That's one of my favorite scenes in that movie.
It's my favorite, one of my favorites. Yep. Okay, have you seen or interacted with fairies yourself?
Yeah, I have. You know, and that's something that I don't always talk really publicly about.
Oh, well, then we can change the subject. You've got
no, that's fine. It's more because I think as soon as you start talking about personal experience, it tends to put people in sort of a different mindset for what they're listening to. And I admit that I can be very, let's talk about the academia and the recorded folklore. But yeah, I as far back as I can remember, I've had experiences and seen things, and you know, moving forward into adulthood, I joke often when I teach classes on this subject that part of the reason I really started studying it was self-defense, because I needed the context, and I needed to know the etiquette, basically what to do and what not to do, because I had this around me sort of whether I wanted it or not. So,
well, that's a good direction to go in. tell everybody what do they need to know etiquette wise if they suddenly find themselves dealing with fairies.
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing to really try to understand, because there is so much misinformation out there, and not all of it is, misinformation that's coming from a negative intention. Some of it's very well-meaning misinformation, but when we're talking about these beings, because it is such a broad category, there's so much in it. While some people may be lucky enough that they only ever interact with beings that are more positive, or the tinier little sort of garden spirit sort of fairies that people can be familiar with, that's definitely not everything that's out there. There's quite a huge range, and some of them are dangerous, which is not something that everyone really likes to hear, but it's true. And the bulk of what we have for the older material really is focused on protection for the most part. And I find that the most important things people need to know going into this subject is that you're not dealing with human beings. You're not dealing with things that are human. One of the things that is kind of problematic with a lot of modern fiction is the way they get anthropomorphized, and they're really just kind of sparkly magical humans. In the reality, if I can use the term reality here, when we're dealing with these subjects, when we're dealing with this subject as a practitioner, or just someone out and about in the world, the human world, these are beings who are not human, and they have a very inhuman approach to things. And a lot of the encounters that you'll read about if you study folklore are things where the actions of the good folk, the fairies, are sort of inexplicable on the human end. We don't always really understand why they're doing what they're doing. And they do have some sort of rules that seem to apply across the board. These are specifically for the Celtic language speaking fairies, I want to say, because every different area is slightly different in how these rules are. If you look at the Norse or the Icelandic, the Huldafolk, the Alfar, some of these carry over, some of these don't. So you kind of have to look at different places as if you were literally going to different countries with different etiquette. But the Celtic language speaking areas, general statements that can be made. It usually is not a good idea to acknowledge you can see them, unless it's really clear that they wanted to be seen or they were trying to get your attention. They tend to really value their privacy, and there's a lot of stories, both folklore and anecdotal accounts, of people who saw them and made a point of being clear they had seen them and basically get their butts kicked, sometimes really physically attacked and beaten up, because they don't like being observed if they don't want to be observed, and kind of attach that as this idea of secrecy, that a lot of times when they do interact with people, they don't really want you going out and sharing a lot of details of these stories. That varies a little bit, depending on what the encounter was and what happened and what it was like. Another big one, they're very big on politeness. You don't necessarily want to say thank you, because there's certain groups where that's offensive. So I find it's easier to just say something else, not thank you. But general politeness, please, you're welcome. Company manners, as I like to say, or, grandmother manners. It's the other way I'll sometimes say it.
Okay, one of the things that I've heard both ways, and this may fall into different cultures have different etiquette, but one is never eat anything if you're in fairy, and it's like never refuse them if they offer you something to eat. And it's like, okay, that leaves us with useless advice. What would you say?
generally the don't eat anything is good advice. That does vary a little bit, I think, particularly in Iceland, the Icelandic fairies. It's a little safer to eat their food. If I remember correctly, it'd be rude to refuse it. But with the Celtic language speaking fairies in particular, the idea is that if you eat or drink any of the food of the otherworld, anything that they try to give you, you are going to be trapped there, or in some other sense belong to these beings, which
It
is
sounds
not a
like you're
positive
saying.
thing. Kind of. It's very similar to that idea of you eat the food of the underworld, you're stuck in the underworld. There are a few exceptions to this, particularly if it's like one of the kings or queens of fairy offering you food, or if you're trading, if they're giving it to you in payment for something you've done, or you've literally paid for it, you gave them something and this is how they're paying you back, then it's fine to eat it. It seems to really only be an issue if you are taking it without anything in exchange. Because the implication there is that you are in exchange. You are trading yourself, which is, no cupcake is worth that. Not even a fairy cupcake. So, that's kind of the angle that it seems to come in at, that there's a debt or an obligation with taking the food. So you will see stories where, for example, there's one story, I believe this is from England, where people hear fairies inside a hill, and they're having an issue baking. They've broken one of the wooden tools that they need. So one of the people just quickly kind of carves it, sort of a big wooden spatula kind of thing. I don't cook, as you can tell by the fact that I don't know what these things are called, and puts it on the hill for the fairies to take. And in exchange, they're given this like fairy bread, which they eat, and it's perfectly safe. Nothing bad happens to them. So usually when we see stories where people are eating fairy food, it's because they did something for the fairies, which is why they were given the food. It didn't just appear and they took it and everything was okay. When we see stories of people eating fairy food, usually there's negative consequences for them because of that. So
Well, that could be because basically when there's the plot, you get a better story. And the time, so nobody bothers talking about it if something amusing doesn't happen to them. Being
like I said, there's
more from the northern tradition, we share our foods with the various entities, whether it's Thor or whether it's the House White or whether it's the Disir or others. We share our food and they share with us, and so we're quite comfortable with sharing food. So I think that the ones we deal with are probably safe to talk to share with.
From what I'm familiar with, which would be more specifically the Icelandic and then German, they don't have the same sort of idea that you shouldn't eat the food. In fact, I know in the Icelandic, you're at more risk if you refuse a gift. If the Huldafolk or the Alfar give you something,
I wonder if perhaps
you need to take it. Okay, I'll keep talking because I don't know where Chipicon went. So, yeah, when we talk about the food, fairy food, it also seems to have some aspects of either grounding the person or transfiguring the person, making them part of the other world, which is sort of what traps them there. Because we do see stories that sort of revolve around that, the idea of removing all of the human world from them and then having them eat or drink the food of fairy, and then they're part of that world and unable to return to the human world. which doesn't seem to work in reverse, because we also have a lot of stories of fairies eating human food, like left, right, and center. Again, I think there's a level of obligation that's going on in that. When they're taking human food, it's because it was owed to them or due them, so it belongs to them in some sense, if that makes sense to everyone.
Yeah.
But we definitely do see fairies eating human food in quite a lot of the
Does-
stories without any consequences.
I should ask if anybody has any
Anything-
questions.
Good. Does anything good ever happen to people from eating fairy food?
Not in the stories. Generally, when it shows up in stories,
Ruin my childhood.
it's either a negative, or we will sometimes see it as sort of a neutral. Like there's a story of Finvara, who's one of the fairy kings in Galway. I should say he is the fairy king in Galway. There's only just the one. Where a man encounters him and he gets sort of invited back to the fairy mound where he lives, and attends this feast and eats, and there's no consequence involved with him. But it's because it's the king of the fairies who invited him, and he's sort of under that guest hospitality safety rule that goes on with a lot of cultures, where, you know, if you're the guest of the king, nothing bad really is supposed to happen to you. You're protected, which is a different, again, etiquette kind of thing. Although that's true in human world as well. Guesting and hospitality rights
Right.
are sort of a big thing.
Or
but-
used to be.
Yeah, theoretically. So that in that case, like there is food involved, but it's sort of a neutral, like it doesn't benefit him in any way. Nothing good comes to him from it, but nothing bad happens either. It's just a part of the story, which, you know, is more about his experience where he is. There's also quite a few stories with fairy food that are rather grim in nature. There's some, for example, where someone is invited to what they think is a big feast, and usually something happens at some point that kind of breaks the human out of the magic that's going on, and they see that what's actually in front of them that they thought was this, you know, mouth-watering feast is actually like old leaves and mold and acorns and things that humans would not generally eat, that they've been sort of tricked into thinking. There's fairies have this kind of magic called glamour that can confuse human senses, so that they think this is a delicious feast when actually it's kind of gross. And there's also a story that's definitely a little darker in tone, where someone is kind of like brought among the fairies, so to speak, and they're preparing for a feast, and the human kind of overhears several of the fairies talking about what they're preparing for the feast is this old woman who had died, and she was sort of a nasty, stingy woman when she was alive. So the fairies are sort of joking about, like, this is a fitting way for her to end up. Much to the horror of the human who's overhearing this, who now does not want any part of this delicious feast. So there is a legitimate argument that you probably wouldn't want to eat fairy food because you don't actually know what it is.
Okay.
Just
Yeah,
something to think about.
Yeah, well, I usually there's a balance, good and bad. So you had mentioned the bad, so I wanted to know if there was the good side also.
Sure.
Just a balance question.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a balance in a wider sense when it comes to these beings. You know, they're known to heal people if they choose to. They're known to help, sometimes like with just good luck, sometimes literally like financial aid, basically. They're known to, for people that they are fond of or that they've taken a liking to or who they owe in some way, to do different things that were definitely benevolent or helpful to that person. The other side of that is they're also known to make people sick, madness, death sometimes. So they have that balance in that sense of they can cause good things to happen, they can cause bad things to happen. It just kind of has to do with which particular being you're dealing with and how they feel about you as an individual. It's often what it comes down to in the stories. Although, getting back to that etiquette question, being polite and well-mannered and kind of following the rules that they have can go a long way as well. There's a fairly well-known story in Ireland called Lusmore, and it's literally the word for foxglove in Irish, but it's the name of the main character in the story, who was born with a deformed back and has kind of always gone through his life like this, but he's a very nice person, gets along with everyone. Going home one night, gets tired, decides to, stop by the side of the road and get some rest. Ends up kind of at the side of a fairy hill and starts hearing the fairies inside singing, and they're singing this song. And I'm not going to sing it in Irish for you because that would just be mean. I'm not going to sing it at all because that would be very mean on my part. But the song is basically Monday, Tuesday, Monday, Tuesday. And he waits until the right moment and sings the next part of the song, Wednesday, Thursday. And of course, the fairies are delighted. They now have the second verse to their song. So they start singing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They invite him in and, he dances with them. He just has this wonderful night. And when they're getting ready to have him leave, the king of that particular fairy hill says that to thank him for teaching them the second part of this wonderful song, they're going to heal him. And they sort of throw him up in the air. And when he comes down, his back is healed and is perfectly straight. And so he goes, back to the rest of his life. But there was this other person sort of in his community that also had a deformed back. And that person's mother sees Lismore and says, what happened?
Yeah.
Clearly, there's been a change. And so he tells her, I was out walking and this is what happened. And it's the fairies. So she kind of makes her son go to try to do the same thing. But her son is not a very nice person. He's just a very mean-spirited kind of guy. Yeah, he's a dick. And so when he starts hearing the fairies singing, instead of waiting until the exact right moment, not interrupting, he just kind of busts right in with the next part of the song. And of course, the fairies are very offended. They're very angry. He's ruined their singing. He was very rude. So they kind of drag him in and start sort of throwing him around, much to his dismay. And eventually they throw him up in the air the same way they had Lusmore, but when he lands, his back is twice as deformed as it was to start. And that's sort of the punishment. They literally give him the deformity they had taken away from the other man, to teach him a lesson about manners. Effectively, the good folk are extreme in sort of all aspects of everything, and that would be considered one of the gentler things they could have done. But yeah, that's one of the more sort of well-known stories.
Well, they could have eaten him.
They could have. They could have done a lot of things to him. We definitely see across folklore, like I said, that whole range of everything from helpful to harmful. There's another story of a man who, of course, was renting. Renting is still is, but was very common in Ireland, and he didn't have the money to pay his rent. His rent was coming due, and they would be evicted. They would be thrown out. His whole family. So he was very distraught. Went down to the side of the lake and was sort of, weeping to himself at what was he going to do. And the stranger appears and asked him, why he was upset. So he told him, I don't have the rent money. We're going to get evicted. And the stranger says to him, here, I will give you the gold that you need, the coins that you need to pay your rent. But make sure you get a written receipt. Make sure you get it in writing, a note that you paid. And of course, the man is delighted and is like, yes, what can I do? And he's like, you don't need to thank me. Just make sure you do exactly as I say. So the man takes the coins, he goes to the rent collector and pays it and insists on getting the written note that says he paid. And the next morning, the rent collector gets up to check, the tallies of the rent he'd gotten the day before. And all the coins that he had gotten from that particular man have turned into gingerbread cookies. Because that's what they were the whole time. They were never really gold. And there's nothing he can do about it because the man has proof that he paid. And how is he supposed to say that he took gingerbread instead of coins without realizing it? Oops. And that's one of the fairy kings, they say, did that, is the kind stranger in the story. So, they can definitely do random acts of kindness if they like a person.
Or alternately, it's entirely possible that perhaps the fairy king already knew the lender and he didn't like him.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to ascribe motives to know for sure why they do what they do. But yeah, either way.
I have a couple other notes. This isn't fun, but I'd want to get you to talk about changelings a little bit. Because changelings are people actually are now talking about. Occasionally people still wonder if their kid is a changeling.
Oh, it pains me so much when I hear that. Yeah. I know. It's definitely gained a lot of recent interest, I guess we'll say. The premise of changelings is a changeling is a fairy or an object, magically, kind of like the gingerbread coins, magically glamored to look like a human, who has been substituted or exchanged for a human who has been stolen by the good folk, because they do that. And this often today in particular, when people talk about changelings, they focus on children or babies, but the older changeling lore, it could be any human. And we do see babies and children mentioned, but it's also fairly common to see stories with particularly new mothers, women who had just given birth, who are taken, and also sometimes just generally adult women or adult men who were taken, and then this substitute was left in their place. The substitute in some stories is like a piece of wood made to look like the person. In some stories, it's just an older fairy. And in some stories, especially with the infants and children, it's a weak fairy baby who it seems likely the way it's described is not going to survive. So they're kind of trading that out for a healthy human baby and taking it. The reason that I kind of said what I said at the start of this, when you first asked about changelings, that it makes me sad to hear people wondering if their own children are changelings, is, first of all, as I just said, the implication is that the real child is stolen and is gone, has been taken by the fairies, and that what's been left is an inhuman, non-human fairy being or magical object. The other reason is because the changeling folklore in particular has a very dark history to it. A lot of people died over the course of it, because they were thought to be changelings, and the methods to recover a human who had thought to be taken were fairly brutal. I see someone in the chat is mentioning Bridget Clary. Bridget Clary was the last known public case of a changeling in Ireland. She was an adult woman who they now think probably had pneumonia, but her husband became convinced that she was a changeling, that his real wife had been taken. He convinced her father and brother as well. And they tried a series of sort of potions and different methods, including, I believe, dousing her in urine, which is a traditional changeling cure, none of which obviously worked. And eventually they did kill her. She was burned alive in her home because he believed that she was not really his wife. He honestly believed that his real wife would come back if they drove out this changeling. He was tried and convicted for her murder. And that was in 1890 something. I'm going to forget the exact date, 1898, the late 1890s, somewhere around then, 1895. But that's not the only example we have. There are other accounts, including many with children, where, for whatever reason, one particular account that I am aware of off the top of my head was a girl who had been born partially paralyzed. I believe she was quadriplegic from birth and never spoke. And when she was about 4, her parents became convinced with the help of a third party that she might be a changeling. So the story goes. And she, I believe, was drowned because that was another thing that they would do, was put them in the river with the idea that the fairies would not let harm come to a fairy. If that's what it actually was, that they would come and rescue the fairy child or the old fairy rather than let them be harmed. And that they would have to, again, by the fairy etiquette, they would have to return the human that had been taken. We see a lot of accounts like that. Other suggested cures to get the human child back and force the changing to leave are things like sitting them on a heated piece of iron. They're enormously cruel is what they are. And people did die because of this. So I sort of have a bit of a hobby horse, I guess you would say, on the topic of changelings when people sort of embrace it in modern terms. I have heard people use it as a term of endearment for their children. And it just...
I'm thinking, in my mind, it's associated with the people these days who believe themselves to be otherkin, which means that some of their soul has been in an otherworldly existence, and therefore they're bringing some of their dragon or bringing some of their elf or bringing some of their something else into this incarnation. And so I can see changeling as kind of well, to a certain extent they are looking. I see Allura Firebird mentioning people who are autistic being thought of, and certainly autistic people have a different way of perceiving things, which is very cool and not properly appreciated in our culture.
Yep. So, but I want to say 2 things to preface what I'm about to say.
Okay.
First of all, I am autistic myself. I've also been part of the otherkin community for over a decade. I don't actually remember when that started. So I have seen that, and I don't ever try to police people's self-identity in any way with that sense. I will say strictly from an academic perspective, and again, not trying to tell anyone what they should or should not identify as or with. The idea of changelings being a way to explain autistic children is something that started around the 1990s. It was a way for folklorists to try to explain, if fairies are not real, these things do not exist, then what would make people do this? What would make them believe this? And they kind of came up with this idea that maybe it was autism. You have to understand, though, that idea from the 1990s grew out of an idea from the earlier part of the 20th century, the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, where people thought that changelings were children with Down syndrome or other types of mental retardation. And that particular theory was enormously racist. It was really rooted in this idea that they were throwbacks to earlier races of humans. It's super gross to read. I can point you to sources if you want to read it, but just brace
A lot
yourself.
of
It's
early
unpleasant.
psychology is really disturbing.
Right. So
Freud.
I tend to have a little bit of bias against the idea that autistic people were changelings or vice versa, just because I know that that's just a new incarnation of this older theory. I certainly think that there are some autistic people who are otherkin or who are not necessarily human souled or human ancestry or however you want to look at it. But I don't think that all autistic children are inherently changelings, in part because it implies that the real human child was stolen and is in fairy. And that to me kind of plays into what a lot of parents of autistic people are saying anyway, which is that their real baby was stolen away. And no, my mother is stuck with me. In fact, I am her child. I apologize for nothing.
As opposed to, I have seen many people who got diagnosed with autism, and then their parents later said, you know what? Now that I know more about autism, I think I'm on the spectrum. So you can catch it from your kids.
Yeah. I think that, because people will also talk about how it's so much more common as a diagnosis these days. But I think what people don't realize is that for a long time, people really weren't open to the diagnosis. And for a long time, particularly girls and women, it was very hard to get an autism diagnosis. It was something that was considered more for boys, and usually in more extreme cases. I think as psychology has progressed and we've learned more about autism and what it is, we've realized that it is something that does apply to more people, which I think is wonderful, because knowing that that's what's going on, knowing that you're not neurotypical, really does help you, in my experience at least, understand yourself a little better and why you struggle with certain things, or you're good at certain things, or whatever. And it gives you a direction, as opposed to feeling like, I just don't understand, why am I so weird, why don't I fit in. But that all said, that the subject of autism and changing is super controversial. And
well, I've got a couple questions as we are getting closer to the end of the hour. I have a couple questions that I wanted to ask you. Maybe I'll give them to you in a clutch. I'm interested in your take on the time shift from going into fairy and coming out. Why looking through a stone with a hole in it, or a ring, or some of the other things enhances our ability to see into fairy? Okay, there's two to start with.
Sure. To take the second one first, I think that looking through a hold stone or a ring works in many cases to help people see into the world of fairy, because it sort of forces you to focus your perception. And it also puts you in a mind space where you are expecting to be able to see into that reality. You're sort of putting aside any mental blocks you might have that's stopping you from doing it beforehand. It's sort of a magical tool in that sense of, you might not need it, but having it is going to put you in a frame of mind where it's much more likely to work when you use it. That sort of super focused, I expect. Now I feel like I should be telling you can't simply walk into Mordor, where you expect that if you look you are going to see something. And that primes you to actually be able to see it. So that's kind of my take on the second question. Remind me what the first one was.
The time shift.
Oh, right.
Why
Time
time
shift.
is different when you go to and from.
It's a fascinating question, and it's something that I think we find across different types of folklore. It just seems to be that whatever this other world is, this world of fairy, it's a reality that exists parallel to ours and connected to ours, but it is not identical to ours. It doesn't have the same rules. Why it is that the beings who are native to that world seem to have an ability to navigate or control this time difference and humans cannot is a very open question. I don't know the answer to that. Catherine Briggs talks about it a little in her book, The Fairies in Tradition and Literature, and basically sort of describes it as a world that's moored to ours, but like a ship on a dock that it moves, it floats. And that the beings from that world seem to be able to judge that shift so that they can come and go without losing time. But humans taken into that world often have a difficult time coming back without losing big gaps of time, decades in some cases, or centuries. It seems to be something that we just don't understand. But I don't think anyone has the answer for exactly why the time difference exists.
Okay, well, we can, since we're getting close to the end, before I push the audience to ask questions again, what is the biggest misconception about fairies that you really would like to make go away?
I mean, probably if you ask me that every single day, I'll give you a different answer. But probably, I think at the moment, the biggest misconception that I would like to make go away is the idea that they are all benevolent, helpful spirits that are kind of victims of Christian propaganda, but that actually are super nice. Yeah, that are just super nice and wonderful and want to help us if we would just let them. And I think one of the reasons that frustrates me is because if you look at cultures around the world that have any sort of connection with different spirits, there's always positive spirits, there's always negative spirits, there's always spirits that have to be protected from, or, you know, that have to be banished. And the idea that for some reason Western Europe would be devoid of that, that Western Europe only ever had really nice, helpful spirits, but the rest of the world is different. And I'm talking places that have no Christian influence, like places that are you know, not Christian and have never been Christian. You still see this pattern of positive spirits and negative spirits, helpful spirits and harmful spirits. So I think that that's something that's just inherent to the spirit world, whether we're talking about otherworldly spirits like fairies, or whether we're talking about really anything that's non-human. You're going to have that range. It's just natural, in my opinion.
Okay, so I would like to prod the audience to ask questions, because I'm feeling greedy right now. I've gotten to do all the asking. Anybody have anything they were hoping to hear when they came in?
Ask away.
Ask away. If not, I just come up in my head with a thing that said FDA warning on fairies, the Fairy Daimler advice. FDA warning there.
I'll have to remember that.
But
so let me see. So Sheena has a question.
You see, oh, who? Good. Is it Frank?
What would be, Sheena, what would be the biggest guidance for discerning between the nature of an other folk who comes into your experience? I think you have to be very cautious with any new spirit that you're kind of meeting. One thing about the other folk, which I could have mentioned in etiquette, but I didn't, is they don't lie. They will always verbally tell the truth. They can still be super deceptive, and they've had a lot of practice at it. So you can try asking them really specific questions. You just have to understand that you have to look at the layers of the answer. So like if you meet a member of the other crowd and you ask, do you mean me any harm? They might say no. They don't mean you harm. That doesn't mean they're not going to do you harm, or they're not going to stand there and watch harm happen to you. That sort of stuff. Like you have to be very precise with what you say, and you have to pay attention to the answers. So beyond that, just kind of look at what they're doing, how they're doing it, what they're saying, how they're saying it. If they seem too nice, that usually to me is suspicious. The ones that are the most dangerous in the stories are usually the ones that initially seem the friendliest. The ones that are the friendliest usually act fairly like humans.
Kind of like my boyfriends.
Okay, 2 participants hands. Which ones? Okay, Frank Stormcatcher.
Yeah,
Had a
I
question?
have my hand up, but that was only because I
Okay.
couldn't get back in, and that's the only way I could get back in.
Yeah, I think you're
Okay.
looking at the Facebook and I'm looking at the Zoom chat. So
Okay. Okay, what about, does Frank Stormcatcher have a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
So, what is the deal with cold iron? I have never, I've heard one or two
Question.
decent definitions, but I've never heard a definitive one.
well, the definitive definition, I can give that to you. The definitive definition of cold iron is any weapon made of iron. And that's the old definition. The modern definition today would be cold steel, usually for guns. It's sort of an old vernacular term. I honestly don't know why in the last 10 years there have been this like flood of wacky cold iron definitions coming out. I do know one reason is it was used in a D&D game, and they really redefined what cold iron was to make it work within the game. And that's where we get this whole cold forged iron idea. But that's super recent. And there are some bits of folklore with iron that say it would have to be forged by a blacksmith, because blacksmiths kind of have their own magic in pretty much every culture everywhere. But generally speaking, cold iron is any iron weapon, traditionally any edged piece of iron. Any piece of iron in general will work to ward off or protect against many types of fairies, not all, but many. And steel also works. Some of the newer folkloric accounts mention steel instead of iron as steel's become popular. Chemically, steel and iron are extremely similar. The usual iron content of steel, I believe, is 92% or higher, depending on the alloy. So I've done a lot of research into this. But yeah, if that answers your question.
It does. So if there's a prescription against having cold iron in their presence, is basically don't have a naked weapon.
Yes. Yep. And there are accounts of people who, for example, there's a Welsh account, and this is in a book by an author called Weird Sykes. It was 1891, of a gentleman who was traveling through the mountains, and basically the Elian, who are a kind of Welsh fairy, start sort of mobbing him. And finally, in kind of desperation, he pulls his dagger and they all take off. But clearly, having the dagger on his belt in the sheath was not enough to keep them away. It wasn't until he pulled the blade and was holding it, and then they scatter. So definitely the idea that you would have to have that naked blade going on is an aspect of it, as opposed to just having it, which makes sense. If you're just
Yep.
carrying it, that's not a threat. If you pull it out, then that's a little different.
I'm thinking I might get in a little trouble if I walked around with one.
Well, in the modern world, yes. There's
Thank you very much.
Okay,
let me
before we run
see.
off, I would like to ask what new book, I guess you're not going to be doing any tours in the immediate future, but
probably not.
Oh God, I would have loved to have gone to Iceland with you.
That was such a great trip too. It was ridiculous.
But when you can associate with other people, you will probably do trips again, tours. Yep. Cool. What books are coming out now? What book has just come out that we should be looking for that we might not have caught? I hadn't caught the encyclopedia before, so shame on me.
That encyclopedia is my baby. A new Dictionary of Fairies that came out last year, and that
I'm loving it.
I put a lot of heart into that one. The last book I actually had published, I self-published, is a new translation of the Kamoitura. This is my fun hobby for everyone that hasn't had a conversation with me before. I translate Old and Middle Irish into English. So I took the Kamoitura, which has been translated twice previously, but never completely. It's always had sections left out, and I did a full translation.
Wow.
And I published that. That came out December. I don't know what month it is anymore. It came out in December of 2020. And then I have Pagan Portals Lou coming out the beginning of May, which is a book, small introductory book to the Irish god Lou. So that's the next thing coming out. I'm always doing something. Got to keep busy.
Can I quickly, I found I missed a question on the Facebook. Are the fairies different than ancestral spirits?
Yes. There is a little bit of blurriness and crossover. And you will sometimes see people who were living humans among the fairies. We do have both folklore and anecdotal accounts of people that are taken, whether they're taken alive, whether they're taken after they die is kind of a big open question, but who are taken to join the fairies, become fairies in various ways. But not all fairies were once human. There's definitely a large range of these types of beings who are not human, have never been human. They're just a separate kind of being. So if you picture it like a Venn diagram is usually what I tell people. We just don't know for sure how big that middle section where they cross over would be. And if one is like otherworldly fairies and one is like human dead, there's a little segment where you're going to have both people that were once human that are now fairies. And then there's a segment, the rest of that circle, of beings that have only ever been fairies, that haven't been anything else. So
I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight.
my job here is done. Someone in the Zoom chat had asked for a good fiction reference to actual fairies. My main recommendation is Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. That is a pretty accurate depiction of the other crowd. Pratchett's Lords and Ladies, which is mentioned in the chat, would probably be second on my list because that's another really good one. There are a few good ones out there, but yeah, a lot of fiction, unfortunately, they just really over anthropomorphize them. If the fairy in the story is just acting like a human being with some magic, probably not the best fiction reference.
Can you translate? Nicole S. wrote something in the chat.
It means basically like thank you.
Thank you for being on the show.
Yeah.
That.
Roma agate would mean thank you, and then Mila is like 1,000, so like a 1,000.
Cool. Okay, so it is time for me to thank you and let you get back to your writing and parenting and all the other things you do. And
Okay.
remind everybody, tell your friends. We do the Wednesday shows to try and suck you all into Changing Times, Changing Worlds, which is basically a conference where we accept that this stuff is real and move on from there. So that, yes, with supernatural, paranormal, occult, metaphysical, whatever. Yeah, this stuff is real. Deal with it. Now, let's see how we can get better at using it. And it's just so nice to have a community and a conference where we can take that as a given and then move on.
It's always a
And
good
so,
conference.
November, mid-November, once again, we have decided that we don't think that enough people will be COVID resistant to plan it. So we're going to be doing the week-long conference again in November. Look at Changing Times, Changing Worlds.net and CTCW.net. And we're going to have, do we have blog posts? We welcome blog posts from anybody else. If you want to send me a blog post, I'd like that. We do the Wednesday nights, they're all free. We're good. They get up usually within a day up on the YouTube channel, which I put a link to in the chat. But tell your friends, because it's so nice to find a place where you can talk to people who you don't have to feel your way around.
Yep.
And with people who know what they're talking about.
We had mentioned at the beginning that if anyone had any pronunciation questions, I don't know if we still have time for that, but you can find me on Facebook if you want to know how to pronounce.
Well, they're not going to kick us off.
Aren't they?
So,
I'll turn into pumpkins.
but anybody who wants to turn into a pumpkin, thank you for coming. And anybody who doesn't, just don't click that you're going away, and I won't turn it off until Morgan leaves.
Okay.
Well,
I'll
thank
try to.
you. I'm afraid I have to go away. So good
Okay.
night, everybody. Thank you,
Thanks
Morgan.
for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have quite a crowd this time. They don't all fit on the screen at once. That's kind of cool.
That is. I'll just try to quickly hit a couple terms.
Okay, great.
Slaniv. That's me saying goodbye to someone who just said goodbye in the chat.
How do you pronounce that? I've seen it written.
Slan.
Slan. Okay.
Slan is like health, but it also is like goodbye. So you see like Sangafol is like see you later.
Like aloha.
Yep. Sanawalia, safe home. So Tewateg is Welsh. A lot of people see that one. It's spelled Tylwythteg. It's pronounced like Tewateg. Not sure I can do it slower. My Welsh, by the way, is scary, but doing my best. Tewateg. Welsh is not my forte. We did start with she. Sidhe is the older spelling. Si with a fada is the newer spelling. Just pronounce she.
Okay.
That's what she said.
How about Bean Fiza?
Banfasa? Sure. Ban means woman, and Fasa is like wise. So Banfasa is wise woman. The plural is Manafasa, because you'd pluralize woman into women. You don't usually see that though. Usually you're just going to see Banfasa. So I think Fairfasa would be the male version. It's also one you don't see very much. And
You can tell when the academics start talking, they want to know how things are spelled and pronounced.
yeah, I'm trying to put everything in the chat. We also have Kayak. Kayak is the name of associated with the goddess, but it also means hag or witch. So you'll sometimes see Banfasa kind of contrasted with Kayak or Kayak Fasa.
Let me know when you look at the
Kayak. Okay.
Kayak. Yep. And then different terms.
Yeah, I'm a lot more familiar with the Old English.
Remember how to spell. I'm dyslexic, so me trying to spell in any language is always super entertaining. And again, I'm putting this in the Zoom chat, but we also have for names for the good folk in Irish, Na Ushla or Tina Ushla, which is the gentry or the noble folk. You'll see that one sometimes. Tina Maha is another one, the good people. Tina just means people. So you'll see that one. A lot of these terms start with Tina. Tina Ushla, Tina Maha, Tina Ella, the other people, the other crowd. Ace she and Tina she are other terms you'll run across. She means the fairy hills or the fairy mounds. It's also now come to kind of mean the beings from those places as well. So Tina she, people of the fairy hills. Ace she, also people of the fairy hills, but Ace has a slightly more sort of implies nobility as opposed to just general people, whereas Tina is just like the word for person, people. So I'm trying to think of any others people might run across. Tina Maha is probably the most common one that you'll see in Irish besides she. A lot of people will just use she. And then there's other like more specific terms, but I don't know if we want to get that. This will become like an Irish language lesson. I don't know if we want to go there. But did anyone have any other questions about specific terms they've seen in Irish that they weren't sure how to pronounce? Silence. Good. I think that covers the highlights.
So I guess that we could release you and say thank you. It's not like you're a genie in the bottle. We can take this, rub the seal off. But.
Well, thanks to everyone for showing up and listening to us talk for an hour and 12 minutes. It was fun.
This is why I do this, because I love it.
It was good. We had an interesting range of topics. So
yeah, well, I would love to have you back at another time and when you have the time, but I don't want to take time away from your writing. as a consumer of the especially the series, the Pagan Portals series, it's like, yes, this is a good series.
They're such fun books, and they're nice because they're short, so they're not like super heavy to get through, but they kind of cover all of those important basics.
The basics. I believe in a broad knowing a little bit about a lot of things, and then you can make connections. Anyway,
that's a good way to approach it.
Well, it's my way of doing it, so I'm happy with it. Other people can say, no, you're not a master of anything. It's like, yeah, well, that's okay. Okay, so allow me to write this in the chat so you can remember it. The Fairy Daimler advice, FDA warning. So nice. Don't think you know what you're doing. We've had pixies, and I came up with pixie spray to get rid of them.
Iron charged water.
Yeah, some nettles and some nails and some salt, and then spritz it around the room. But I also, there were entities, small entities I could just catch if I would go into a light trance in the ICU when my husband was there. And I believe that they were called by people praying, and they were still flitting around the ICU wanting something to do. So I called them and I said, here, you work on his kidneys and you work on his lungs and you work on his, and they were very, very happy to have something to do. And at the end, I said, is there anything that you'd like in exchange for your help? And I listened and I heard candy. So the next day I brought in a large chocolate bar and they said, that's not candy. I said, what? No, candy. And they projected this image of colored
candy.
sugar.
Yep.
And so I went down and I found Skittles and I put the Skittles and they're like, ah, and then they all kind of grouped around that and then they went back to working. I think they are more, those entities, whatever they were more interested in healing than they were in the candy, but they were perfectly happy to have the candy.
Right.
Do you have is there anything in the lore about candy?
Honestly, there isn't. And I'm going to say something here that's going to also disappoint the few people that are still listening to this. Glad everyone else has left. I do think there are types of spirits that like candy, particularly the modern hard sugar candies. I don't want to say older because that's not exactly what I mean, but the more traditional, the good folk, the Terlateg, those sorts of beings in the Celtic language speaking cultures, when they take food, they're specifically taking sort of the vital essence out of it. And traditionally they want things like dairy products, sometimes bread or cake, fresh fruit, fresh vegetables. They want things that still have a lot of life force in them, to be kind of blunt about it. And the sugary hard candies don't have any. They're, I'm being honest, but they wouldn't. They're very chemical and they're very processed, and they're many, 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 many steps away from what they started out as. And these are beings who really want that essence, that the way I explained it to my son when he was 5 about why we put milk out for the good folk is that they take the soul out of it. Mm-hmm. And it needs to be something that has a soul, that has that vital essence, that energy to it. So beings that are feeding on things like the sugary candy, I think, are something else. It's a different category of thing.
There's so many different things out there.
Oh yeah,
we don't know what they are.
Yeah,
but
well, and exactly. We don't even know what all of them are. Yeah,
but like the ghosts in the Greek traditions gain enough strength to speak by drinking the blood of the sacrificed animals. Again, they're going for the life force, and obviously these beings don't need that. They're not getting that because they were giving life force to the patients.
Yep, they want something else.
So I think they're healing. I think they like the color.
Yeah.
If you could hand them a rainbow, they'd probably be happy with that. Hence the Skittle.
That sounds like a mythic quest right there. Yeah. Get a rainbow to hand the healing spirits.
I drove through a rainbow in Kauai once.
Yeah.
It was coming down right in the middle of the road. And as I approached it, I figured I would change angles and I would stop seeing it, but I didn't. And I drove right through the end of it. Ah!
That is so cool.
That is so cool. Yeah. Kind of like what you were doing in Iceland.
I was just going to say, talk about Iceland earlier. I've never seen so many rainbows in my life. It's like every day, rainbows everywhere.
Did you see any Elfar?
I did. And trolls, which is interesting. I've never seen trolls before until I went to Iceland, and then it was like, oh, okay. That's interesting. I actually have a personal theory with the trolls, because they say they turn to stone in the sunlight. Just based on my observation, this is completely my personal thing, not folklore. It didn't seem like they were stone during the day, but they moved extremely slowly. Like during the day, they seemed like they could only move at like 1/100th speed, sort of a thing. And that made me wonder if that was where the idea that they turned to stone came from.
Oh, and my theory had been that there's so many beings that live in mounds, from fairies to ancestors to, that they had simply gone into rock, and therefore people thought, oh, they turned into rock. It's like, no, they just used that as a portal.
Yeah, all the ones that I saw from a distance, mind you, but they were all in very rocky areas. I mean, there is a lot of that in Iceland in certain places. This is around Keflavik and Reykjavik, kind of that area in the south, that I was seeing what I was seeing. And yeah, we got to stop at one Alfakirkja, which is one elf church, one elf stone, which was super interesting. Iceland is just an intense place, and there are spirits and huldafolk everywhere. I honestly have never been anywhere like that. I've been to Ireland several times, and I love
Milwaukee
Ireland.
is like that.
Yeah, it's intense.
Well, I think I should chase everybody away, because this is not the part people are going to be one.
This might be exactly the part everyone wants to watch.
It could
Yeah.
be. That's why we're trying to have the the breakout rooms this year at the conference, so people can take a conversation after a class and go. So that's going to be cool.
Yeah, I think left to our own devices, we could just keep talking for another hour. So
We could, but sleep is good too.
yeah, we should probably free everyone.
Okay, I'm going to okay, this is your chance. Give me a wave if you have something to say.
If anyone has any final questions, I know someone very early on had mentioned Tulpa, and I really didn't have any time to get into Tulpa and Egregores and why those are different from fairies.
That's why
That
there's a
would-
whole conference.
that would be a
Tell
long
your
conversation.
friends. Changing times, changing rules is cool.
Tell your enemies.
Don't you want to keep them ignorant? No, we don't. Okay, that's been proven this last year or 4. Okay. Okay. Well, I will say thank you. I will not say it in this foreign language, but thank you. And I'm about to push the button now. Okay. Love you guys. Stay safe. Wear your masks. Wash your hands. All that stuff. And believe in it's real.